So since I started going down the rabbit hole of researching pregnancy, birth, and everything relating to babies and taking care of babies, I have read stories that women have shared, mostly women have shared on Facebook groups. And at first I was just flabbergasted. My mind was blown at how this kind of stuff could happen, at how so many women didn't educate themselves on the topic, and it led to them making decisions that they ended up regretting. So I'm going to start off with some examples because I think telling these stories might give shape to the point that I'm going to be making eventually. So in relation to birth, a common thing that I read was that a woman's doctor, her obstetrician, would at first be all pro natural birth, and then come closer to her due date, so somewhere around 36 weeks, the doctor would start almost prepping her for an early induction and then a C-section. And the way that he would prep her was using fear tactics or fear mongering. So he'd start talking about possible complications and saying that it looks like she might be at risk for example, having a big baby, or the cords around the baby's neck, or waiting past 40 weeks would put the baby at risk, and things like that. And at least as far as I've seen, very often in these cases, women tend to not have done very much research into it, or not enough to be willing to stand their ground on what they want to do. So what ends up happening is that 2 weeks early, the woman goes in to be induced into labor, which often fails because it's 2 weeks early, and then that leads to an emergency cesarean. Now, I'm not going to go into why doctors do that. That's a whole other story. But after this happens, and once the baby is safely in their arms, very often these women come to share their stories and say that they were bullied, and that they recognize now that they were bullied. But while it was happening, they were so scared of what they were being told. They were so scared that what choices they wanted to make would harm their child, that they would just go along with what their doctor or the expert was telling them. And because it didn't sit right with them, they went afterwards to go and do some research and came to the conclusion that A, it's a very common practice by doctors, and B, it was completely unnecessary. And they're now in this place within themselves where they thought what they were doing was the best for their baby, even though they wanted to have a natural birth. And they're now in this space of regret and trauma because they feel like they were duped. They feel like they were bullied and betrayed by a person who was supposed to have their best interest and their baby's best interest at heart. So that's one example, right? And let me just say that in the cases where the woman has done a lot of research and does know that what the doctor is telling her is not based on evidence, however, she's not very confident within herself, and so she's not very good at standing up for herself. So because of that, she allows herself to be bullied, and eventually ends up allowing the doctor to do whatever he is recommending against her better judgment. So, that's another way that it can play out. But in any case, then another example of fear-based decision making is, so in this breastfeeding group that I'm part of, daily women are sharing their stories of how they're now pregnant with their second child. Their first child, they were breastfeeding, but they stopped, or they had to top up with formula or whatever, and it was because it seemed like their baby was always hungry, and their parents were telling them that they weren't producing enough milk because their baby's hungry all the time, and it shouldn't be asking for more milk 10 minutes after it just nursed. Or maybe it's the in-laws, or maybe the pediatrician feels like the baby is not gaining fast enough, or is not bulking up enough. So then they end up eventually switching over to formula. And if you want to go into that rabbit hole, go and look into how breastfeeding works and how milk production works, and you'll see that milk is produced on a supply and demand basis. So the more the baby drinks, the more milk is produced by the breast. Obviously, this is in most cases. There are rare cases where a woman is not able to produce enough breast milk, but that's not relevant to this particular point right now. So the other thing to look into is the behavior of newborn babies, which is it's completely normal for a baby that is a week old, or 2 weeks old, or 6 weeks old, or 8 weeks old, or up until 3, 4, 5 months sometimes, to want to nurse frequently. It's completely normal. Breast milk is metabolized quickly, first of all, so it's digested quickly, and nursing is a way for the baby to connect, to soothe, to feel safe. So these women who are now on their second child and who've maybe learned a little bit more are coming and asking for advice, and the place that they're coming from is, again, this regret that they didn't know well enough the first time around with their first child to ignore what they were being told to do by whoever was telling them to top up with formula because their baby looked like it was always hungry, in spite of it gaining well and having enough dirty nappies and such. And again, the reason that they followed that advice in the first place was because they were so fearful that maybe this person is right. Maybe I'm not producing enough milk. Maybe my baby is always hungry and I'm not giving it what it needs. So I better top up with formula, or I better switch over to formula, because then at least when I give my baby a big bottle of formula, they're not hungry anymore, which obviously they're not, because they're not designed to drink a huge amount of liquids all at once. Breastfeeding, the baby's stomach is designed for breastfeeding, which is a little bit of milk and frequently. Anyway, so again, there's this decision that's made out of this fear of doing the wrong thing, this fear of harming the child. But it's also done, let's say, in complete ignorance. There is no self-responsibility taken. Obviously, this is not in all cases, but this is something that I'm seeing is pretty common. So there's no self-responsibility taken to educate ourselves about these things. It's like we're willing to blindly trust and follow the advice of any person who we regard as an authority figure. And it seems to be a pretty common thing, especially in Western society, from what I've seen, where we want to make our decisions based on expert advice on everything under the sun. And we have stopped, if we ever did before, but we don't do our own research. We don't investigate it for ourselves. We, again, just blindly follow this expert advice, so-called expert advice. And in a lot of cases, when it ends up being a mistake, we only recognize the need to educate ourselves after we've gone and made all of these mistakes, after the damage has already been done. And what I've been looking at within this is the dynamic of how we've lost trust in ourselves, because we don't even consider our own intuition and our own common sense within these things. We dismiss it right off the bat, like it's especially when it comes to babies, the automatic assumption is that I don't know anything and I better listen to what other people say, even if it goes against everything that my body is screaming at me to do. So now you have women who don't hold their babies when their babies are crying because the doctor told them not to, and who don't feed their babies through the night because the doctor told them the baby should be sleeping through the night by now, or who are trying to live according to a strict schedule in spite of the reality of what their baby is showing them they need. And it's like this recurring dismissing of our intuition, this recurring acting against our own kind of better judgment, if you want to put it that way. We just are whittling away at our self-trust and at our self-regard to a point where what we feel about something becomes completely irrelevant. Like, we don't even acknowledge how we feel about something, because if it's not in line with the experts' advice and the experts' opinions, then it must be wrong. Automatically it's wrong. So we have just gotten into this habit of completely disregarding ourselves. And the damage that this is doing, not only to ourselves and to our ability to make choices for ourselves within the context of our own lives, aside from that damage, it's damaging the people in our lives as well. Just think of all of the children who grew up according to so-called expert advice, who were also now taught that their own opinions are automatically wrong, that they shouldn't trust themselves, they shouldn't even ask questions, they should just blindly follow what they're told to do by someone who with a certain label of expert, because experts know better, right? So all of this has brought me back to this point, which it does every time, of how important it is to do our own research, to investigate all things, and to keep what's good, to ask questions, to be willing to have difficult conversations that come from difficult questions, and to be willing to recognize when someone disagrees with us, or when someone judges us or attacks us for asking questions or for voicing our views on something. It's not a reflection on us, it's a reflection on who they are. It's a reflection on the dogmas that they're living according to, and the judgments that they've shaped their life around. So just because someone is so incredibly opinionated that they're willing to try and tear down anyone who has a different opinion doesn't make you wrong, and it doesn't make you inferior. It just makes them a little bit of an extremist, right? And our tendency to internalize other people's reactions and internalize other people's attempts to attack and dismiss us is part of this vicious cycle where we keep breaking ourselves down and are just slowly losing touch with ourselves. And you know what happens when we lose touch with ourselves? We lose touch with everything around us, because connection can only come from within ourselves. And if we're so caught up in living according to shoulds and should nots that we completely ignore ourselves, we're shutting off our ability to connect effectively with other people, with the world around us, with nature. And look around and we can see the effects and the consequences of that kind of living everywhere. So right, this has gotten incredibly long, so I'm gonna I should end this right now. I hope that it made sense. I do have a serious case of fuzzy brain. This is like literally the 12th video attempt on this topic. Right, if you have questions, or if you want to continue the conversation, drop a comment, send me a message, whatever. I'm around and I am happy to have open conversations on these topics. So, thanks for watching.